In the cradle of America's freedom, where liberty's light pierced the darkness, one man forged a bond in shadows, twisting blood and desire into a chain that bound his soul to eternal judgment. What if the daughter you raised was destined to become your wife? Tonight, we unearth the divine reckoning that followed. In the verdant expanse of Henrico County, Virginia, where the James River carved lazy serpents through fields of swaying tobacco leaves under the relentless gaze of the 1784 summer sun, the Caldwell estate stood as a monument to ambition cloaked in piety. Millhaven Plantation, with its grand Georgian manor house of red brick and white columns, overlooked acres that whispered of prosperity earned through sweat, soil, and the silent toil of enslaved hands. To the outside world, the neighboring gentry in their powdered wigs and silk gowns, the merchants in Richmond's bustling taverns, the circuit-riding preachers who thundered sermons from makeshift pulpits, the Caldwells embodied the triumphant spirit of the new republic. Jonathan Caldwell, the family's unyielding patriarch, was hailed as a visionary, a supporter of the revolution not for lofty ideals of equality, but for the divine right of men like him to seize what God had seemingly ordained as theirs. Yet, beneath the polished veneer of Sunday hymns and harvest feasts, a rot festered, a sin as old as Eden itself, waiting to uncoil like the serpent in the garden. The air in those fields carried more than the sweet, acrid tang of curing tobacco. It bore the weight of unspoken curses, the kind that biblical scholars might liken to the mark of Cain, a perpetual reminder of blood spilled and innocence corrupted. Court documents, yellowed with age and sealed in iron-bound chests within Richmond's archives, speak of a deception so profound it echoed the fall of man. A young girl, Elizabeth Hartwell, plucked from tragedy and molded into a vessel for one man's unholy desires. These records, hidden for generations like forbidden scrolls, detail testimonies from 23 souls, servants, neighbors, even a reluctant clergyman, who bore witness to acts that blurred the lines between familial love and carnal abomination. 3 judges, men hardened by the cruelties of frontier justice, stepped down from the bench in 1789, their faces ashen, muttering of moral contamination too vile to adjudicate. The Anglican Church, still reeling from revolutionary disestablishment, denounced the affair as apocryphal heresy, while the remnants of the Caldwell line scattered like chaff in the wind, fleeing to distant shores under assumed names. But truth, as the scriptures promise in John 8 verse 32, shall set you free, or in this case, condemn you eternally. Imagine the scene. The great hall of Millhaven at twilight, candles flickering in silver sconces that cast elongated shadows across walls paneled and heart pine harvested from the estate's own forests. The light dances like fireflies in a graveyard, illuminating portraits of stern ancestors whose eyes seem to follow every movement, judging, waiting. Jonathan Caldwell, at 42, cuts a figure both commanding and spectral, tall as an Old Testament prophet, with broad shoulders forged from years of overseeing the lash and the plow. His hair, dark as raven's wings, but threaded with silver like veins of quartz in shadowed rock, frames a face etched with lines of calculation rather than care. Those steel-gray eyes, cold as the barrel of a flintlock pistol, miss nothing, not the quiver in a servant's hand as they pour his Madeira wine, nor the subtle shifts in the wind that foretell storms over the river. He moves with the deliberate grace of a man who believes himself chosen, a modern Abraham willing to sacrifice all on the altar of legacy. Jonathan's late wife, Catherine Harrison Caldwell, had been his equal in stature, if not in spirit. A woman whose lineage traced back to Jamestown's hardy survivors, her dowry a cascade of gold and land that solidified the Caldwell dominion. Their union, celebrated in Richmond's finest parlors with toasts to eternal prosperity, had been brief, ended by the cruel arithmetic of childbirth in July 1776, mere days after the colonies declared their independence. Catherine's death left Jonathan a widower in a world reborn, the Revolution's chaos mirroring the turmoil in his soul. Cannon fire echoed from distant battlefields as he buried her beneath a marble angel in the family plot, its wings outstretched as if in futile protection against the divine wrath to come. In her absence, Jonathan's faith twisted inward, morphing from communal piety to a personal covenant with a vengeful God, one who rewarded the cunning and punished the weak. The war years had been a crucible, forging Jonathan's fortune anew. While loyalist planters clung to British tariffs and saw their empires crumble, Jonathan pivoted with serpentine shrewdness. He smuggled tobacco to French allies via Philadelphia's shadowy docks, bartering for gold when paper money fluttered worthless in the breeze. His ledgers, bound in calfskin and inscribed with ink as black as midnight, chronicled acquisitions. Neighboring farms foreclosed in the panic, enslaved laborers purchased at auction for pennies on the pound, investments in Richmond's emerging mills that hummed like beehives of industry. By 1784, Millhaven sprawled across 3,000 acres, a kingdom unto itself, where the rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like the whisper of profits accumulating. Yet, prosperity's crown sat heavy, for Jonathan lacked a son, a male heir to inherit this Eden without division. His grandfather's letters, preserved in a cedar chest like sacred relics, thundered warnings. A divided house cannot stand, echoing Matthew 12, verse 25, lest the fruits of our labor be scattered to the winds of envy and strife. Remarriage loomed as a specter. Eligible daughters from Virginia's elite families, Randolphs, Byrds, Carters, were paraded in subtle overtures at balls and barbecues, their eyes demure, but their ambitions sharp. Jonathan recoiled. He had tasted the yoke of shared power with Catherine, her Harrison kin forever meddling in his state affairs. No, he craved not a consort, but a cipher, a being wholly his, bound by chains of dependence and gratitude, untainted by external loyalties. It was in this void of longing, this spiritual vacuum, where ambition masqueraded as divine will, that Providence, or perhaps Lucifer himself, delivered Elizabeth Hartwell. November 1776 brought storms that lashed the land like heavenly scourges, rain pounding the earth as if to wash away the sins of revolution. Thunder rolled like the judgment trumpets of Revelation, shaking Millhaven's sturdy timbers. Jonathan labored in his study, a sanctum of order amid the tempest. Walls lined with leather-bound tomes on law, agriculture, and theology, locked beside Leviticus, Montesquieu mingling with the Psalms. Candlelight gleamed on his quill as he tallied shipments, the scratch of nib on parchment a rhythmic incantation. The room smelled of beeswax, ink, and the faint, earthy musk of tobacco leaves drying in the barns beyond. Midnight approached when Samuel Brigham, overseer, confidant, and executor of Jonathan's darker whims, materialized in the doorway like a ghost from a gale. Brigham, lean as a whipcord with skin weathered to leather by sun and secrets, had served the Caldwells for 2 decades. His loyalty was ironclad, forged in shared silences over deeds best left unspoken. Master Caldwell, Brigham intoned, his voice gravelly with import, rain dripping from his oilskin cloak onto the Persian rug, a luxury imported pre-war. Calamity on the Richmond road. Carriage overturned in the deluge. Fine folk by the look of it. Jonathan's quill paused, hovering like a hawk scenting prey. Quality implied pedigree, and pedigree meant leverage in this nascent nation where bloodlines still trumped ballots. Details Samuel, he commanded, his tone even, but his mind already weaving webs of possibility. 2 miles out, at Devil's Elbow, where the creek bends treacherous. Driver perished, horses fled into the night. The gentleman and lady thrown and broken on the rocks below. Brigham's eyes, shadowed under his tricorn hat, held a glint of something unspoken. One survivor, a girl child, 10 or 11 summers, tossed into the brambles, spared by grace or fortune. She's addled, sir, babbling of an Uncle Thomas, but little else. Jonathan leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking like old bones. An orphan of means, vulnerable, impressionable. Papers? Effects. Brigham shifted, his neutrality a mask Jonathan knew well. William Hartwell, wife Margaret, daughter Elizabeth. Traveling west for land in Kentucky. Gold in their coffers, sir, a tidy sum. Documents suggest distant kin, hard to trace in these wild times. The word gold sparked like flint on steel, but it was the girl's isolation that ignited true interest. Fetch her hither. Cleanse her, nourish her, clothe her in warmth. And Samuel, Jonathan's gaze pierced like a dagger, will converse privily on the rest once she's abed. An hour later, the guest chamber, once Catherine's domain, with its damask curtains and mahogany four-poster, held a tableau that seared Jonathan's soul. Elizabeth perched on the bed's edge, swathed in a borrowed nightgown of fine linen, its folds pooling like moonlight on marble. The fire crackled, casting golden hues on her damp chestnut curls, mirroring Catherine's own tresses and illuminating features of ethereal delicacy. High cheekbones, a pert nose, eyes deep as forest pools, fringed with lashes still wet from tears or rain. She clutched a porcelain cup of warm milk, her manners impeccable even in grief, thanking the housemaid Martha with a voice soft as summer wind, accented by the polish of tutors and drawing rooms. Jonathan entered, his boots silent on the Aubusson carpet, and lowered himself to a velvet-upholstered chair, meeting her gaze at level. The resemblance to Catherine struck like a thunderbolt, divine mimicry or demonic jest. "Your name, child?" he queried, his baritone modulated to paternal warmth, belying the storm within. "Elizabeth Hartwell, sir," she murmured, her composure fracturing like thin ice. "My parents." Samuel spoke of an accident. "Are they truly departed?" The query hung, pregnant with innocence, as the fire popped, embers dancing like damned souls. Jonathan's hand extended, patting hers, a gesture of solace veiling appraisal. Her skin was soft, unmarred by labor, her nails trimmed and clean. Intelligence gleamed in those eyes, resilience in her posture. Not a waif to be discarded, but a gem to be shaped. "Alas, yes, my dear, but fear not. You're under my aegis now. Come morn, we'll seek this Uncle Thomas, rally your kin." Yet, as he uttered these platitudes, darker visions bloomed, a child without anchors, moldable as clay in the potter's hand. Biblical echoes resounded, Lot's daughters in Genesis 19, preserving lineage through taboo, or Ruth's devotion, twisted to serve ambition. "You're gracious, sir," Elizabeth replied, exhaustion etching her features. "Without your mercy, I'd be lost to the night." Jonathan's smile masked the genesis of a plan profane. "It's but Christian charity, child, and I foresee our paths entwined by Providence itself." That eve, as Elizabeth slumbered under Martha's vigilant eye, her breath shallow, dreams haunted by carriage wheels and screams, Jonathan descended to the wine cellar, a vaulted crypt of stone and shadow, bottles racked like skeletons in a catacomb. Brigham awaited, lantern casting grotesque silhouettes. Their colloquy, whispered amid the chilled damp, birthed a conspiracy. Letters forged, inquiries feigned, gold sequestered. The Hartwell's kin, ensconced in Kentucky's rugged wilds, would receive no word, couriers lost to bandits or floods. Elizabeth, bereft of past, would be Jonathan's to raise, not as ward, but as future bride, a union to consolidate blood and land, defying God's edicts on kinship. Months blurred into years, Millhaven's rhythms enveloping Elizabeth like a shroud. She learned the estate's secrets, the tobacco barn's smoky haze, where leaves hung like sacrificial offerings, the slave quarter's muffled spirituals, hymns of Exodus yearning for Pharaoh's fall, the manor's library, where Jonathan tutored her in classics and scripture, his hand lingering overlong on hers as they parsed Proverbs' warnings against folly. He clothed her in silks reminiscent of Catherine's wardrobe, schooled her in etiquette that mirrored his wife's grace. Neighbors whispered of his adopted daughter, a charitable act lauded in church pews, blind to the undercurrent of possession. Yet, spiritual omens mounted. Dreams plagued Jonathan. Catherine's ghost, accusatory finger pointed like Ezekiel's visions of judgment. Storms ravaged crops, as if heaven wept for innocence defiled. Elizabeth, blossoming into adolescence, felt an unease, a biblical disquiet like Eve sensing the fruit's poison. Subtle manipulations deepened. Isolation from peers, tales of her lost family's demise, Jonathan's gaze shifting from fatherly to fervent. By 1784, at 18, she stood as Millhaven's mistress-in-waiting, her resemblance to Catherine a haunting mirror, fueling Jonathan's delusion of resurrection through sin. The deception's web tightened, threads of guilt weaving a noose. Forged documents proved no blood tie, though whispers among servants, Brigham's iron grip silencing them, hinted at buried truths. Elizabeth's queries about Uncle Thomas met evasion, her letters intercepted by fate. Jonathan's sermons at family chapel twisted scripture, Abraham's near sacrifice as obedience's pinnacle, ignoring the ram's mercy. Divine retribution loomed, unseen but inexorable, like the plagues upon Egypt. As seasons turned, tension coiled, a stolen glance at a harvest ball, a hand on her waist during dance lessons, electric with forbidden fire. Elizabeth's soul stirred with dread, echoes of Psalm 51's cry for cleansing from hidden sins. Jonathan, blinded by hubris, pressed onward, envisioning a wedding that would seal legacy, daughter as wife, sin as salvation. But cracks emerged, a servant's overheard murmur, a visiting clergyman's probing questions. The winter of 1789 brought unraveling, courtrooms echoing with testimonies like prophetic denunciations. Witnesses recounted the accidents, anomalies, Brigham's timely arrival, Gold's disappearance, Elizabeth's isolation. Judges recoiled, invoking Leviticus 18's prohibitions against uncovering nakedness. In the end, divine justice prevailed. Jonathan, stripped of title, faced exile, his empire crumbling like Babel's tower. Elizabeth, freed yet scarred, sought redemption in anonymity, her story a cautionary parable of ambition's fall. Millhaven's fields, once verdant, lay fallow, overgrown with thorns, a tangible curse, reminding that what man sows in darkness, God reaps in light. This tale, unearthed from dusty tomes, warns of inherited sin's shadow, where paternal love perverts into possession, inviting heavenly wrath. In Virginia's cradle of freedom, bondage took many forms, some chained in iron, others in blood's forbidden bond. In the shadowed corridors of Millhaven Plantation, where the James River's murky waters lapped against banks stained by the toil of generations, Jonathan Caldwell's machinations took root like poisonous vines in fertile soil. The year was 1776, and Virginia's air still reeked of gunpowder from revolutionary skirmishes, a fitting backdrop for a man whose soul mirrored the era's upheaval. Outwardly devout, inwardly devoured by ambition's fire. The Hartwells, Elizabeth's ill-fated kin, had been but fleeting shadows in the Commonwealth's tapestry, migrants from Maryland's Chesapeake shores, drawn south 5 years prior to stake their claim in Norfolk's bustling harbors. Their shipping venture, modest yet thriving amid wartime shortages, dealt in rum, indigo, and the occasional contraband that evaded British blockades. Yet, their roots ran shallow. No deep-seated alliances bound them to Virginia's elite. Whispers in taverns spoke of their westward ambitions, lands in Kentucky's untamed wilds, promised by speculative deeds, but the frontier's perils swallowed many such dreams without trace. A carriage splintered on rain-slicked roads? Such tragedies were commonplace, chalked up to God's inscrutable will or the devil's delight in chaos. Jonathan, ever the opportunist, seized this void with the precision of a biblical serpent offering forbidden fruit. Within weeks, his study, walls clad in walnut panels scarred by the passage of time, air thick with the scent of sealing wax and aged leather, became the forge of his deception. By lamplight that danced like hellfire on his furrowed brow, he penned forgeries that would make Machiavelli blanch. Documents, inked in a hand mimicking faded colonial script, proclaimed the demise of Uncle Thomas. Fell by ague in Kentucky's fever-ridden swamps, his passing unmarked save for a fabricated notarized affidavit from a phantom frontier clerk. The timing? Exquisite in its cruelty. Mere fortnights before the Hartwell's doom. Close enough to stir pity, remote enough to defy scrutiny in an age when couriers braved Indian raids and swollen rivers for months on end. Presenting himself before Henrico County's beleaguered clerk, a harried soul buried under wartime petitions and land disputes, Jonathan embodied the epitome of genteel benevolence. His attire, a tailored coat of deep indigo, wool embroidered with silver thread, bespoke unassailable status. His voice, resonant as a pulpit oration, wove tales of Christian duty. This child, orphaned by Providence's harsh hand, finds in me a guardian ordained by fate, he intoned, proffering the parchments with a flourish. The clerk, eyes glazed from endless ledgers under the dim glow of tallow candles in a drafty courthouse of weathered brick, stamped approval without demur. War's aftermath had bred such haste. Who would question a pillar of society, a revolution supporter whose tobacco fueled the new nation's coffers? Thus, Elizabeth became his ward, a legal tether binding her to Millhaven's fate, her innocence a blank slate for his profane inscriptions. The assimilation unfolded like a slow poison seeping through veins, gradual, insidious, cloaked in kindness. Elizabeth, her young mind fractured by grief's hammer, found solace in the plantation's rhythms. Dawn choruses of roosters piercing mist-shrouded fields, the earthy aroma of plowed furrows mingling with the sharp tang of wood smoke from distant cabins. Jonathan orchestrated her world with maestro's finesse. He summoned Miss Adelaide Fenwick from Richmond's refined circles, a spinster of 40 winters, her spectacles perched on a beak-like nose, her dresses of somber gray surge whispering of Puritan austerity. Adelaide's lessons, conducted in the sun-dappled parlor with its velvet drapes and Chippendale chairs, encompassed the graces of a lady, embroidery stitches fine as spider silk, harpsichord melodies echoing Handel's sacred oratorios, etiquette manuals dictating the precise angle of a curtsy before gentry. Yet, Jonathan's benevolence masked a deeper sacrament, a ritual of control. He lavished her with finery, gowns of imported silk that shimmered like moonlight on the river, books bound in Moroccan leather expounding Virgil's epics and Locke's treatises. The household staff, under Brigham's watchful eye, treated her with deference bordering on reverence. Martha's calloused hands pressing fresh linens scented with lavender, cooks preparing delicacies like syllabub frothed to ethereal lightness. Isolation was his truest ally. Visitors were rare, screened through Jonathan's lens, ensuring no external light pierced the veil of dependence. In this cocoon, Elizabeth's spirit, resilient as spring saplings, bent toward him, viewing her guardian as both father and savior. A twisted echo of the prodigal son's return, but inverted, with a father's embrace concealed chains. By winter 1778, as snow blanketed the tobacco barns like shrouds over forgotten graves, Jonathan ventured to Richmond, the journey a gauntlet of rutted roads flanked by skeletal oaks. The city buzzed with post-war rebirth, merchants hawking broadsides proclaiming liberty, taverns alive with debates on the Articles of Confederation. In Cornelius Vance's offices, a sanctum atop Main Street's federal edifice, redolent of piped tobacco and fresh ink, Jonathan unveiled his grand design. Vance, a diminutive figure with fingers ink-stained from drafting wills and deeds, embodied discretion's art. His eyes, sharp as quill points, asked no questions when gold crossed his palm. The room's mahogany desk, scarred by countless signings, bore witness to audacities that skirted heaven's laws. First, adoption papers, meticulously worded to enshrine Elizabeth as daughter and heir, her rights to Millhaven's vast acres, fields yielding hogsheads of prime leaf tobacco, forests teeming with game, river docks bustling with flatboats, irrevocable absent male issue. To the world, this was charity incarnate, a widower's balm for solitude, aligning with Proverbs 22 verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go. Filed publicly, they burnished Jonathan's halo amid church whispers of his piety. Second, the marriage contract, a document of diabolical ingenuity, its clauses coiled like adders in Eden's grass. Penned in Vance's elegant script, it bound Jonathan Caldwell to a bride of suitable lineage and virtue, to be named henceforth. Timelines amorphous as morning fog, identities veiled in legalese. Such instruments, though rare, echoed colonial precedents where alliances forged fortunes. Think of the Byrds and Carters, merging estates like biblical tribes uniting under Joshua's banner. Unfiled, it slumbered in Vance's vaults, a ticking malediction awaiting activation. As years wove their tapestry, 1779's harsh frosts yielding to 1780's bountiful harvests, Elizabeth matured under Jonathan's gaze, her form blossoming like the estate's magnolias, petals unfurling in creamy splendor. Her education intensified, a curriculum laced with subversion, French conjugations laced with tales of royal intrigues, Latin verses from Ovid's Metamorphoses hinting at transformations both mythical and monstrous. Mathematics tallied plantation yields, but Jonathan infused lessons with parables of legacy. How Abraham's seed multiplied through unorthodox means, how Lot's lineage endured via daughter's desperate acts in Genesis 19, framing taboo as divine necessity. He sermonized in the family chapel, a stone edifice where sunlight filtered through stained glass depicting Judgment Day, his voice booming like thunder over pews. Family is the ark amid floods of adversity. Blood must preserve blood, lest the wicked inherit the earth. Elizabeth, seated in her embroidered cushion, absorbed these with wide-eyed devotion, her chestnut locks now cascading in waves, her eyes, mirrors of Catherine's, reflecting a brew of gratitude and unease. Isolation deepened. No suitors called, no balls attended without Jonathan's shadow. Whispers among slaves, hushed songs of Exodus, spirituals invoking Pharaoh's fall, echoed her growing disquiet, a spiritual ferment like yeast in dough, rising toward revelation. By 1782, at 16, Elizabeth embodied perfection, grace in her step across Persian rugs worn by ancestral feet, intellect sharp as a dueling saber in debates over Hume's philosophies. Jonathan's conditioning peaked, tales of Caldwell forebears who defied norms for survival, equating loyalty with surrender. She was the linchpin, he murmured during evening constitutionals along river paths lined with willows weeping like mourners. You, my dear, are redemption incarnate, vessel for our eternal flame. Spring 1784 heralded the crescendo, amid blooming dogwoods painting the landscape in ethereal white. Jonathan summoned her to the study, air heavy with beeswax and anticipation. Correspondence from a cousin, he announced, producing a missive, forged of course, detailing a matrimonial alliance to fuse Caldwell branches. This union safeguards our Eden, honoring debts to the past. The miniature portrait, presented with flourish, captured her breath, a visage eerily akin to Jonathan's, strong jaw shadowed by candlelight, eyes piercing as divine scrutiny, attire evoking a decade past. Jonathan Caldwell, he named him, kinsman from Shenandoah's valleys, builder of fortunes in tobacco's embrace. Confusion furrowed her brow. The resemblance, the shared nomenclature, echoes of biblical doubles, Jacob and Esau vying for birthrights. Explanations flowed like poisoned honey, naming traditions honoring patriarchs, mutual benefits in social ascent and estate consolidation. You shan't depart me, he soothed, noting her distress with predatory glee. He'll reside here, merging realms under one banner. Dependence, cultivated like rare orchids, rendered separation a spiritual abyss. Preparations ensued, shrouded in anomaly. No grand nuptials with fiddles wailing reels, guests in finery toasting with punch bowls brimming ruby port. Instead, a clandestine rite at Millhaven. Witnesses handpicked, Brigham, Vance, a compliant minister whose Bible hid doubts. Jonathan justified, war's diaspora, travel's treacheries, orphans' decorum demanding restraint. Invitations, unseen by Elizabeth, purportedly dispatched. Responses, non-existent, funneled through Vance's phantom channels. Correspondence with the groom? Denied as tradition's veil, respect's mantle. September brought Vance's carriage rumbling up the Oak Line Drive, laden with folios like harbingers of doom. Documents unfurled, inheritance clauses, settlements intertwining fates. Elizabeth, quill hovering, questioned obscurities, deeds shifting her heirship, phrasing labyrinthine as minus maze. Assurances reigned. Mere formalities, child, your safeguard in matrimonial metamorphosis. Yet her tutored mind, honed on legal tomes, sensed heresy, a perversion of Romans 7:2's marital bonds. Sleepless nights in her chamber, canopy bed draped in brocade like a funeral pall, pieced the mosaic, anomalies stacking like Babel's bricks, inviting heavenly tumble. October's chill eve delivered apocalypse, creeping to the study for solace in verse. House creaking like accusatory bones, wind moaning psalms of lament, she beheld Jonathan, illuminated by candelabra flames flickering as infernal tongues. Papers arrayed in regimented phalanxes, the portrait juxtaposed with a mirror, his reflection mimicking the painted guise. The revelation struck like lightning on Sinai. No cousin existed. The groom was Jonathan himself, a self-portrait from youth, doctored to deceive. Incest specter loomed, a violation of Leviticus 18:6 decree. None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin. Horror flooded her veins, cold as the river's depths. The man she called father sought to claim her as Eve to his Adam, twisting creation's order into abomination. In that moment, spiritual warfare ignited, guilt chains clashing with justice's call. Elizabeth's soul, forged in isolation's fire, now burned with righteous fury, a prelude to the divine reckoning that would shatter Millhaven's illusions. The legacy Jonathan coveted would crumble, not through inheritance, but exposure's light, proving Ecclesiastes 12 verse 14. For God shall bring every work into judgment, with every secret thing. This chapter of deception, rooted in Virginia's post-revolutionary soil, where liberty's ideals clashed with slavery's chains and ambition's thorns, unveils humanity's frailty. Jonathan's plan, a monument to hubris, echoed Cain's fratricide, blood crying from the ground for vengeance. Elizabeth, unwitting pawn turned avenger, embodied redemption's spark, her discovery the first crack in damnation's dam. As autumn leaves fell like judgments from on high, the stage set for confrontation, where mortal sins met immortal gaze. In the oppressive hush of Millhaven's midnight corridors, where floorboards groaned like the lamentations of the damned underfoot, Elizabeth Hartwell retreated into the darkness, her bare feet silent on the chilled oak planks worn smooth by generations of Caldwell footsteps. The air hung heavy with the scent of beeswax from dying candles and the faint, metallic tang of ink from Jonathan's quill, a perfume that now twisted her stomach into knots of revulsion. Her heart thundered in her chest, a frantic drumbeat echoing Psalm 38's cry. My heart panteth, my strength faileth me. As for the light of mine eyes, it also is gone from me. What she had witnessed in the study, a man, her adoptive father, preening before a mirror to mimic the portrait of her supposed betrothed, unraveled the fragile threads of trust she had clung to for 13 years. The resemblance was no familial echo, no benign coincidence of bloodlines. It was a perfect forgery, a self-portrait aged by artifice, revealing Jonathan as both architect and actor in this profane theater. The revelation crashed upon her like the floodwaters of Noah's judgment, drowning illusions in a torrent of horror. No cousin lurked in Shenandoah's misty valleys. No distant kin awaited with open arms and tobacco fortunes. Jonathan himself intended to stand at the altar, veiling his paternal role in matrimonial robes, transforming daughter into wife through a sleight of legal hand that mocked God's ordinances. Leviticus 18 verse 9 thundered in her mind, "Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy sister, the daughter of thy father." A divine prohibition Jonathan had contorted into permission through his hubris. The wedding, mere weeks away, loomed not as union but as desecration, a spiritual sacrilege where filial bonds twisted into carnal chains, ensuring his legacy through incestuous progeny. Elizabeth stumbled back to her chamber, the four-poster bed's canopy draping like a funeral veil, and collapsed on a linens still warm from her restless slumber. Moonlight filtered through lace curtains, casting spectral patterns on walls adorned with faded tapestries of biblical scenes. Eve's temptation, Lot's flight from Sodom, mocking her predicament with their tales of forbidden desires and divine retribution. Dawn broke over the plantation like a reluctant mercy, the sun's rays piercing the James River's fog-shrouded banks, gilding tobacco leaves in a false halo of gold. Birds chorused outside her window, their melodies clashing with the dread coiling in her soul. Elizabeth rose, her reflection in the dressing mirror a ghost of the girl she once was. Cheeks pale as parchment, eyes shadowed with the weight of knowledge, chestnut hair disheveled like a crown of thorns. She dressed in a simple muslin gown, its fabric whispering against her skin like accusatory whispers, and vowed to unearth the truth using the very intellect Jonathan had honed in her, like a blacksmith forging a weapon that would turn against him. Her education, once a gift, now became her arsenal. Lessons in logic from Aristotle's tomes, scrutiny of documents from Vance's legal primers, observation skills sharpened by Miss Fenwick's etiquette drills. She moved through the day with feigned composure, her smiles brittle as autumn leaves, while inwardly she plotted reconnaissance amid the household's rhythms. The plantation pulsed with life, oblivious to her turmoil. Slaves in the fields bent under the sun's lash, their rhythmic chants evoking spirituals of deliverance from bondage, mirroring her own yearning for exodus. In the kitchens, pots clanged like judgment bells, steam rising with the aroma of cornbread and stewed greens. Elizabeth seized moments of distraction, Jonathan conferring with Brigham in the stables, where horses nickered softly amid the hay's sweet decay, to sift through correspondence in the study. Drawers yielded secrets like Pandora's box. No missives from a mythical cousin, but terse notes from Vance, ink blots staining parchment with phrases like utmost discretion and unconventional ceremony. Bills fluttered into her hands, payments to a Richmond miniaturist for alterations to existing likeness, sums to tailors for garments evoking a decade past, accessories to age a man's appearance subtly. Each discovery layered dread upon dread, a spiritual suffocation as if the devil himself breathed down her neck, tempting her to despair. The pivotal breach came during Jonathan's absence, a rare foray to Richmond's markets where merchants haggled over tobacco bales under the shadow of the new Capitol building, its dome a symbol of revolutionary ideals Jonathan perverted for personal gain. Millhaven lay somnolent in afternoon heat, servants napping in the shade of ancient oaks, their leaves rustling like pages in a forbidden grimoire. Elizabeth slipped into the study, the room's air stagnant with the ghost of pipe smoke and sealed wax. A locked drawer beckoned, its brass handle gleaming mockingly. Recalling Martha's deft repairs on household locks, fingers twisting wire with the precision of a surgeon, she fashioned a hairpin into a makeshift key, the metal scraping like nails on a coffin lid. The tumblers yielded with a click that echoed her racing pulse. Inside lay the damning archive. Unsent inquiries about her parents, their wax seals unbroken like unconfessed sins, forged guardianship decrees, stamps forged in clandestine forges, fabricated letters from the phantom cousin, wax drippings mimicking distant postmarks, and Jonathan's own journals, scripted in his angular hand, detailing the wedding's consummation with clinical detachment that chilled her marrow. Approach with gentleness, one passage read, to bind her eternally, body and soul, ensuring fidelity through shared sacrament. Biblical perversions abounded. References to Sarah and Abraham's half-sibling union in Genesis 20, twisted to justify his design. But the marriage contract crowned the horrors. Vance's elegant script binding Jonathan Caldwell to Elizabeth Hartwell, adopted daughter aforesaid, with no veil of cousinly pretense. Clauses delineated inheritance flows, ensuring progeny inherited unfractured estates, a legal fortress against divine or earthly challenge. Trembling in Jonathan's throne-like chair, leather creaking under her weight, Elizabeth absorbed the scheme's profundity. Adoption secured her as heir, marriage as consort. Together, they forged a closed loop of control where children would bear Caldwell blood untainted by outsiders. In post-revolutionary Virginia, where property laws echoed English common law, women as chattel, estates as sacred trusts, this abomination skirted illegality, prioritizing patrimony over piety. Jonathan's notes extended the vision. Public facades as conventional spouses in Richmond salons, adoption buried in archives, offspring raised in ignorance, their innocence a shield against truth's blade. It was a dynasty built on deception, echoing Pharaoh's enslavement of Israel, where bloodlines endured through tyranny. Nausea surged, a physical manifestation of spiritual revulsion, as if her soul retched against the poison. Every paternal caress, every shared scripture reading, twisted parables from Judges or Ruth, had been grooming, a slow seduction of spirit before flesh. She was no daughter, but a lamb fattened for slaughter, her resemblance to Catherine a demonic signpost guiding Jonathan's descent. Escape clawed at her thoughts that night, bed linens tangled like restraints, but reality's chains bound tighter. No coin in her purse, no allies beyond Millhaven's gates. Isolation a moat Jonathan had dug deep. Flight meant starvation in wilderness teeming with perils. Highwaymen, wolves, indifferent settlers, or recapture as a runaway ward, law bending to Jonathan's will. Evidence, if presented, could paint her as hysterical, complicit in fantasy. The wedding loomed November 15th, a date etched like Judgment Day, time's sands slipping inexorably. Providence intervened November 3rd, a rider emerging from autumn mists like Elijah's chariot, dust-cloaked and weary. Reverend Thomas Hartley, itinerant preacher traversing Virginia's backroads, sought refuge at Millhaven's wrought iron gates, his mount lathered from miles of rutted paths. His name, Hartley, ignited hope's spark in Elizabeth's breast, a flicker amid despair's gloom. 50-ish, with hair silvered like hoarfrost and skin etched by sun and sermon, he wore threadbare black broadcloth, a Bible bulging his saddlebag like a talisman. Dinner in the grand dining hall, crystal glinting under chandelier flames, portraits of Caldwell patriarchs glaring from gilt frames, unfolded with Hartley's tales. Frontier baptisms in icy streams, weddings under starlit canopies, funerals where earth swallowed the faithful. As Jonathan excused himself to confer with Brigham, voices murmuring like conspirators in the hall, Elizabeth leaned forward, her whisper urgent as a prayer. "Reverend, might you know of Hartwells? Distant kin, perhaps, William, Margaret their daughter?" Hartley's eyes, kind as a shepherd's, lit with recollection. "Aye, child, the Hartwells of Norfolk, devout souls, lost to that carriage mishap years ago. Bound for Kentucky to join Margaret's brother, Thomas Whitfield, at his Harrodsburg post. Spoke fondly of young Elizabeth, bright as a new penny. Thomas still inquires, heart heavy with no word." The discrepancy struck like thunder. Not Uncle Thomas Hartwell, but Whitfield, alive, searching, a lifeline across the wilderness. Jonathan's return stifled further revelation, but seeds of salvation sprouted. That eve, as winds howled like banshees around Millhaven's eaves, Elizabeth resolved confrontation. Not for mercy, but evidence. Creeping through moon-dappled halls, gown flowing like a ghost's shroud, she approached the study. Jonathan hunched over parchments, candlelight carving his features into a gargoyle's mask. His gaze lifted, surprise yielding to predatory gleam. "Elizabeth, rest eludes you? Preparations demand vigor tomorrow." Her voice, steady as David's before Goliath, pierced the silence. "No cousin exists. You are the groom, father and husband entwined." The facade crumbled, Jonathan rising like a specter, shadows elongating his form. "Perceptive, my dear. Indeed, one flesh we shall become, daughter, wife, mother to my heirs. Providence's gift from that fateful road." The confession unfolded, brandy-laced breath hot as brimstone. The accident orchestrated, parents slain for gold, her rescue, a kidnapping veiled in charity. Catherine's likeness in her a sign from a twisted deity. Law, he boasted, his plaything, adoption and marriage interlocking like infernal gears. "No escape, child, your kin deem you dust. Submit and thrive in our Eden." Terror mingled with righteous fury, Elizabeth's spirit invoking Esther's courage before the king. Yet powerlessness loomed. His advance, a predator's prowl, sealed her isolation. Divine intervention alone could rend this veil of sin, as the plantation slumbered, unaware of the spiritual storm brewing within its walls. A reckoning where justice's sword would fall on the unrepentant. The great clock in Millhaven's entrance hall had just tolled 3 when Jonathan Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair, brandy glass catching the firelight like a drop of fresh blood. Across from him stood the girl he had raised, the girl he had murdered for, the girl he believed he had broken. Elizabeth's voice was soft, almost tender, as she asked the one question no predator can ever resist. "Tell me how you did it. All of it. I want to understand the genius of the man I am about to marry." Pride is the oldest crack in the devil's armor. Jonathan smiled the slow, indulgent smile of a man who has finally found an audience worthy of his masterpiece. And he talked. He spoke of Norfolk taverns thick with pipe smoke and loose tongues. Of William Hartwell boasting over his 3rd cup of Madeira that he carried 10,000 pounds in Spanish gold for Kentucky land. Of the precise weight needed to tip a carriage at Devil's Elbow when the creek ran high. Of the signal. A single lantern swung 3 times from the tree-lean. Of the moment Samuel Brigham's men stepped from the storm and the night cracked open with pistol fire and screams that were swallowed by thunder. He spoke of seeing her, 10 years old, half conscious in the brambles, her face illuminated by lightning, and recognizing Catherine reborn. "God himself handed you to me," he whispered, eyes gleaming with the fervor of a man who had mistaken Satan for providence. Elizabeth listened without flinching, memorizing every syllable the way a condemned man memorizes scripture. Because upstairs, behind a locked guest room door, slept Reverend Thomas Hartley, a man whose testimony no Virginia court could dismiss. And in her pocket lay the key she had lifted from Jonathan's own ring while he poured the second brandy. The next 12 days were a masterclass in controlled desperation. While Jonathan rode the fields, inspecting winter rye and congratulating himself on the perfection of his trap, Elizabeth moved through the house like a ghost with a mission. She worked only in the stolen minutes, when the overseer was drunk on cider, when Martha was at market, when the house slaves sang their sorrowful hymns loud enough to cover the scratch of her quill. She copied every damning page. She pressed wax seals into fresh clay to forge duplicates. She hid bundles beneath floorboards and inside the hollow leg of Catherine's old spinning wheel. And in the wine cellar, behind a false panel Jonathan himself had built to hide runaway slaves before selling them south, she discovered Catherine Caldwell's diary. Pages warped with damp, ink blurred by tears, final entries describing the bitter taste of her nightly posset and the terror of realizing her husband preferred a dead wife to a faithless one. November 15th, 1789, dawn cold and iron bright. The great hall of Millhaven had been transformed into a chapel of lies. Garlands of evergreen and late-blooming chrysanthemums masked the scent of tobacco and old blood that always clung to the walls. Candles blazed in silver sconces that had once belonged to Catherine. 23 witnesses, planters in powdered wigs, magistrates in black silk, ladies rustling like nervous birds, filled the carved pews, murmuring approval at the romantic tale of a widower marrying his beautiful ward to keep the estate whole. Elizabeth descended the staircase at the appointed hour. The gown was Catherine's wedding silk, taken in at the waist, the same pearls glowing against her throat like tiny moons. She was pale, yes, but not with fear. With the cold clarity of an avenging angel who has counted the cost and found it worth paying. Jonathan waited at the makeshift altar, resplendent in midnight blue, eyes alight with triumph. Reverend Charles Peaton, half-blind and wholly bought, opened his prayer book with trembling fingers. The ancient words began, "Dearly beloved, if any man can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined." Elizabeth lifted her veil. Her voice, clear, steady, edged with 13 years of grief and fury, cut through the hall like the trumpet at Jericho. "I can." She did not scream. She did not weep. She simply stepped forward and laid the evidence on the altar as though it were the body and blood of her parents offered up for judgment. First, the forged guardianship papers, ink still faintly smelling of the walnut dye she had watched Jonathan mix. Second, the ledger pages showing payments to Brigham and 3 other men on the exact night of the murder. Third, Jonathan's own journal, bound in red Morocco leather, open to the entry dated November 14th, 1789. "Tomorrow she becomes mine in the sight of God and man." The circle closes. The bloodline is secured. And finally, wrapped in oilskin to protect it from damp, Catherine Caldwell's diary. Last entry dated July 4th, 1776. He smiled when he brought the cup. "I drank because I still loved him. God forgive me, I still do." The silence that followed was not human. It was the silence that falls when the veil between earth and heaven is torn in two. Jonathan lunged to silence her, but 2 magistrates, men who had hunted Tories beside him during the war, caught his arms. Reverend Hartwell, summoned from the back pew where Elizabeth had quietly begged him to remain, stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Child," he said, voice shaking with awe and sorrow, "you are heard." The rest unfolded with the terrible inevitability of Scripture. Jonathan was dragged from the hall in shackles forged that very morning by Millhaven's own blacksmith. Brigham tried to flee on the fastest horse in the stable. He was caught before he reached the river, still clutching the purse Jonathan had promised him for one final task, silencing Elizabeth if the ceremony went awry. Cornelius Vance was arrested in Richmond before the week was out. His ledgers seized, his career, and eventually his life, ended in a debtor's cell. The trial lasted 9 days. Every seat in the Richmond courthouse was filled. People stood in the snow for hours just to hear the testimony. Newspapers as far as Boston carried the headlines. Virginia planter murders for incestuous heir. Daughter bride exposes 13 years of horror. On March 15th, 1790, beneath a sky the color of old pewter, Jonathan Caldwell was hanged in the public square. The trap fell at noon. They say the rope stretched so long that his boots scraped the ground before his neck finally broke. An extra minute of suffering some called God's postscript. Elizabeth did not watch. She was already westward bound, escorted by federal marshals and Reverend Hartwell, carrying nothing but Catherine's diary, her parents' prayer book, and a heart that would never again trust the word Father. She found Thomas Whitfield at dusk on the banks of the Kentucky River, older, weathered but alive, still lighting a candle every night for a niece he had never stopped mourning. Their embrace beneath a sky full of unfamiliar stars was the first moment in 13 years that Elizabeth Hartwell cried without fear. She never married. The thought of a man's legal dominion over her body made her physically ill until the day she died. Instead, she built schools, first 1, then 7, then a dozen, brick buildings with wide windows and locked gates that no guardian could breach without scrutiny. She drafted some of the earliest orphan protection laws in the young republic, laws that required magistrates to investigate adopters, that gave children the right to speak in court, that made the grooming of wards for sexual purposes a capital crime. Elizabeth Hartwell died on All Saints' Day, 1847, surrounded by children who called her Mother Elizabeth, though she had never borne a child of her own. At her funeral in Frankfurt, the governor wept openly. Senators who had never known hunger laid wreaths at her grave. And on the simple stone she had chosen were carved the words she lived by after 1789. She broke the chains so others would not be forged. Millhaven itself was razed in 1803. The house burned, some said by arson, others by lightning that struck the same spot 3 times in one night. Nothing would grow where the great hall had stood. Corn withered, cattle sickened. For 100 years the land lay, cursed, a scar on Virginia's green breast, until the forest finally reclaimed it. Today, if you walk the trails of what is now a quiet state park, you may find a single foundation stone half buried in moss. Touch it, and some claim you can still feel the cold of iron shackles, still hear the faint echo of a girl's voice rising clear and unafraid above the lies of men. I can show just cause, and somewhere, in the wind through the pines, the answer comes back, not in rage, but in the calm, unshakable certainty of justice fulfilled.